What happens when a Hollywood superstar known for charm and physical charisma walks into a room full of sharp opinions, and a question intended to be lighthearted suddenly becomes a line in the sand? What happens when the audience stops applauding and starts holding their breath, waiting for a response that could change the entire mood of a live television broadcast? Before we continue this story, make sure you subscribe to Prime Spotlight, hit the like button, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on celebrity interviews that take an unexpected turn. The cameras were already rolling inside the familiar set of The View, the warm glow of studio lights casting soft shadows across the round table. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center, her presence as commanding as ever, flanked by Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Sara Haines. The audience buzzed with anticipation, clutching their coffee cups and adjusting their positions for a better view of the stage. Today was different. Today, the guest was someone whose very name carried the weight of box office dominance and global recognition. Chris Hemsworth, the Australian actor who had become synonymous with strength, charisma, and that effortless smile, was about to take his seat among the women who had made morning television appointment viewing for millions of Americans. The audience erupted into applause as Hemsworth walked onto the stage, his tall frame moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in front of cameras. He waved warmly, his smile genuine, and exchanged hugs with each of the hosts before settling into his chair. Whoopi welcomed him with her characteristic warmth, complimenting his latest project and the physical transformation he had undergone for the role. "Chris, it's always great to have you here," Whoopi said, her voice carrying the familiarity of someone who had interviewed countless celebrities but still appreciated the ones who brought genuine energy to the set. "Thank you, Whoopi," Hemsworth replied, his Australian accent softening the words. "It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming on this show because the conversations are never boring." The audience laughed appreciatively, and Joy leaned in with her trademark mischievous grin. "That's because we don't let anyone get away with just promoting their movie," Joy said. "We actually ask questions." Hemsworth laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I would expect nothing less." For the first several minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly. Sara asked about his family life and how he balanced fatherhood with the demands of Hollywood. Hemsworth spoke warmly about his children, the importance of staying grounded, and how his wife had been his anchor through the chaotic years of global fame. Sunny nodded along, her legal mind clearly analyzing his words, while Whoopi watched with the careful attention of someone who had heard countless celebrity anecdotes and could sense when someone was being genuine versus performing. But then came the shift. Sunny Hostin had been relatively quiet during the early portion of the interview, her eyes scanning Hemsworth with the focused intensity of someone preparing to ask a question that mattered. She leaned forward slightly, her pen resting against her notepad, and cleared her throat. "Chris, I want to ask you something a little different," Sunny began, her voice measured but carrying an edge of curiosity that immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. The audience quieted almost imperceptibly. Hemsworth turned toward her, his expression open and inviting. "Of course. Ask me anything." Sunny smiled, but her eyes remained sharp. "Over the years, you've played some incredibly physically dominant characters. Thor, obviously, but also action heroes who embody a certain kind of masculinity that some people might call traditional or even aggressive. My question is, do you think that kind of portrayal in Hollywood has any impact on how men view themselves in real life? Especially young men who might look up to you." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Hemsworth's smile didn't fade, but something behind his eyes shifted. He tilted his head slightly, considering the question with apparent seriousness. "I think that's a fair question," he said slowly. "And I've thought about it a lot, actually. The characters I play are larger than life. They're meant to inspire, to entertain, to give people an escape. But I also understand that young men might look at those characters and feel pressure to live up to something unrealistic." The audience murmured quietly, some nodding in agreement. Sunny pressed further. "So do you think there's a responsibility there? A responsibility to portray something more than just physical strength?" Whoopi glanced toward Sunny, her expression unreadable. Joy shifted in her seat. Sara watched with focused attention. The cameras moved in closer. Hemsworth met Sunny's gaze directly, his voice still calm but carrying a hint of firmness that hadn't been there moments before. "I think the responsibility is to tell stories that feel honest," he said. "And honesty means showing the full spectrum of human experience. Not just strength, but vulnerability. Not just confidence, but doubt. I've tried to bring that to every role I play." Sunny nodded slowly, but she wasn't finished. That's a great answer, she said. But let me ask you this. Do you think the industry rewards men who project that traditional, dominant image more than it rewards men who show emotional openness? The temperature in the studio seemed to drop slightly. Hemsworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his smile remained intact. I think the industry is changing, he said. I think audiences are hungry for more complex portrayals of men. Not just heroes who punch their way through problems, but men who struggle, who feel, who make mistakes. That's what I want to be part of. Sunny leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. And what about off-screen? Do you ever feel pressure to maintain that image in your personal life? The question was direct, pointed, and clearly personal. Hemsworth paused. The audience held their breath. Whoopi interjected gently. That's a very personal question, Sunny. Sunny didn't back down. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate, she said. I'm asking about the experience of being a man in the public eye. I think it's a conversation worth having. Hemsworth nodded slowly. No, it's okay, he said. I appreciate the question. And I think the answer is yes, sometimes there is pressure. But I've also learned that the people who matter most in my life don't want me to be a character. They want me to be me. The audience applauded softly. But the tension remained. What had started as a warm interview had just taken an unexpected turn, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Sunny had challenged Chris Hemsworth on something deeply personal and cultural, and his response had been careful, diplomatic, but not entirely unguarded. The cameras lingered on his face, capturing the subtle shift in his expression. And the conversation was only beginning. The applause from Hemsworth's previous answer had barely faded when Sunny Hostin leaned forward once more, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more pointed. The studio lights seemed to intensify, casting sharper shadows across the table as the conversation took on a new weight. I appreciate your honesty, Chris, Sunny said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and newsrooms. But I want to push a little further on this idea of masculinity and representation. Chris Hemsworth's posture remained relaxed, but his eyes had grown more watchful. He had been interviewed hundreds of times, but he could sense that this moment was different. This wasn't a promotional stop. This was a conversation that had teeth. Go ahead, he said, his voice even. Sunny set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. You've played characters that are physically imposing, powerful, sometimes even aggressive. And those characters have made you one of the most recognizable actors in the world. But there's a conversation happening right now in Hollywood and in society about whether that kind of portrayal contributes to toxic masculinity. What would you say to someone who argues that films like yours reinforce those harmful stereotypes? The audience grew silent. Whoopi shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Joy's usual humor had vanished, replaced by a serious attention. Sara watched the exchange with wide eyes, clearly sensing the tension. Chris Hemsworth took a breath before responding, his jaw tightening slightly. I would say that I understand why someone might have that concern, he began slowly. And I don't dismiss it lightly. But I also think that storytelling is more complex than that. The characters I play aren't just about strength or power. They're about sacrifice, loyalty, protecting others. Those are values that transcend gender. Sunny nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on him. That's a fair point, she said. But do you think those values are always communicated clearly to young men who watch your films? Or do they sometimes walk away with the message that being a man means being physically dominant and emotionally reserved? The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Hemsworth leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. I think that's where the conversation gets interesting, he said, because I believe in the power of storytelling to shape how people see themselves. And I take that responsibility seriously. That's why I've been drawn to projects that explore vulnerability, failure, and the complexity of being human. Those are the stories that matter to me. Sunny tilted her head. But you haven't always chosen those stories, have you? You've chosen blockbusters that are designed to entertain and sell tickets. Chris Hemsworth's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Blockbusters and depth aren't mutually exclusive, he said. Some of the most meaningful storytelling happens in films that reach millions of people. I don't think we should dismiss that. The audience murmured quietly, some nodding in agreement, others watching with heightened interest. Whoopi stepped in gently, trying to ease the growing tension. I think what Sunny is trying to get at is the influence that public figures have, Whoopi said, and whether that influence comes with a responsibility to be mindful of the messages they send. I agree with that completely, Hemsworth said, turning toward Whoopi. And I think about it all the time, especially now that I have children. I want them to see a man who is strong but also kind, confident but also humble. That's the example I try to set. Sunny leaned in once more, her voice dropping slightly. But is that enough? She asked. Is setting a personal example enough when the cultural message is still so powerful? The question was sharp, almost confrontational. Chris Hemsworth's expression grew more serious. He held Sunny's gaze for a long moment before responding, his voice calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. I think the question isn't whether it's enough, he said. I think the question is, what are you doing to change the culture as well? Because it's not just on me. It's on all of us. The media, the industry, the audience. We all have a role to play. Sunny's eyebrows rose slightly. Fair point, she said. The studio fell into a brief silence. The audience held its breath, waiting to see where the conversation would go next. Joy finally broke the tension with a dry comment. Well, this is getting deep for a morning talk show, she said, prompting nervous laughter from the audience. But the laughter quickly faded. The exchange between Sunny and Chris Hemsworth had revealed something deeper, something that couldn't be smoothed over with a joke or a smile. They had touched on a nerve, a cultural conversation that was already playing out across social media and dinner tables. And neither of them seemed willing to back down. The cameras zoomed in on Hemsworth's face, catching the subtle shift in his expression. He was no longer the charming action star. He was a man being challenged, being asked to defend not just his choices, but the very culture that had made him a star. The tension was palpable, and the conversation was about to escalate even further. The studio had become a pressure cooker. What had started as a warm celebrity interview had transformed into something far more intense. A cultural debate playing out in real time before a live audience that had stopped applauding and started listening with rapt attention. Sunny Hostin leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed but her eyes still locked on Chris Hemsworth. She wasn't finished. She had opened a door, and she was determined to walk through it completely. Chris, I appreciate that you're willing to engage on this, Sunny said. But let me ask you something else. Do you think the industry would reward you the same way if you chose to play characters that were softer, more emotionally vulnerable, less traditionally masculine? The question was pointed, almost accusatory. Chris Hemsworth's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. He took a breath before answering, his voice measured but carrying an edge. I think the industry rewards authenticity, he said. And I think audiences are smarter than we give them credit for. They can tell when a performance is genuine. They can tell when a story is trying to say something meaningful. Sunny nodded slowly. But do you think you would have been cast as Thor if you had presented yourself differently? She pressed. If you had been quieter, less physically imposing, less traditionally charming? The question was a trap, and everyone in the studio knew it. Whoopi shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly sensing that the conversation was veering into dangerous territory. Joy's eyes widened slightly. Sara looked down at her notes, avoiding eye contact. The audience held its breath. Chris Hemsworth's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I was cast as Thor because the director believed I could bring something to the role, he said. And I did. But that role is not who I am. I've always tried to separate the characters I play from the person I am. Because if you can't do that, you lose yourself. Sunny tilted her head. And who are you, Chris? The question was simple, but it landed with the weight of a hammer. The studio fell completely silent. Chris Hemsworth held Sunny's gaze for a long moment. His expression was calm, but there was a fire behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. I'm a father, he said slowly. I'm a husband. I'm someone who has been given an incredible platform and tries to use it responsibly. I'm someone who makes mistakes, who learns, who grows. And I'm someone who doesn't like being put in a box. The audience erupted into applause, some rising to their feet. Sunny nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's a good answer, she said. But I have to ask, do you think that image, that box you're trying to escape, is something Hollywood creates or something you've helped create? The applause faded as the audience leaned in once more. Chris Hemsworth leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. I think we all have a role to play in the stories we tell, he said. And I think the most important thing we can do is be honest about our own complicity. I've played characters that fit a certain mold, but I've also tried to push against that mold. It's a process. It's a journey. Sara finally spoke up, her voice soft but curious. Can you give us an example of a time you pushed against that mold? Chris Hemsworth smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. I've chosen roles that scared me, he said. Roles that required me to be vulnerable, to be weak, to be wrong. And those roles taught me more about myself than any blockbuster ever could. Sunny nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly. I appreciate that honesty, she said. But I think the reason this conversation matters is because young men are watching. They're looking at you, at your career, at the characters you play. And they're trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Chris Hemsworth met her gaze directly. Then I hope they see someone who is still figuring it out too, he said. Because that's what being a man really is. It's not having all the answers. It's being willing to ask the questions. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Whoopi finally interjected, her voice warm but firm. That's a beautiful way to put it, Chris. And I think that's the kind of conversation that needs to happen more often. But Sunny wasn't quite done. She leaned forward once more, her voice dropping to a near whisper. One more question, Chris. The studio held its breath. Chris Hemsworth nodded slowly. Go ahead. Sunny's eyes locked onto his. Do you ever feel like you've contributed to the very image you're now trying to push against? The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Chris Hemsworth paused, his expression unreadable. And then slowly he nodded. Yes, he said quietly. I have. And that's why I'm trying to change. The audience erupted into a standing ovation. And the conversation was far from over. The standing ovation continued for nearly 30 seconds, a wave of applause that seemed to wash over the studio like a tide. Chris Hemsworth sat quietly, his expression humble, absorbing the moment with a grace that felt genuine rather than performative. Sunny Hostin finally broke into a smile, her earlier intensity softening into something approaching admiration. Thank you, Chris, Sunny said, her voice carrying across the studio. That was an incredibly honest answer. Thank you for asking the question, Hemsworth replied, his tone warm but still carrying the weight of the exchange. I think we don't talk about these things enough. And when we do, it's often in sound bites or headlines. Having a real conversation is rare. Whoopi nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think that's what made this conversation special, she said. It wasn't just about promoting a movie or being charming. It was about something that actually matters. Joy finally broke the tension with a wry smile. And here I thought we were just going to talk about Thor's hammer. Laughter rippled through the audience, breaking the emotional intensity of the moment. But even as the laughter faded, the conversation continued to echo in the minds of everyone present. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. They knew they had captured something rare, a moment of genuine conflict and resolution that would resonate far beyond the studio walls. Within this fictional scenario, clips of the exchange quickly began circulating across social media platforms. Viewers shared the moment when Sunny pressed Hemsworth about masculinity, when he admitted to his own complicity, and when the audience rose to its feet in appreciation. The phrase "I have, and that's why I'm trying to change" became a viral moment, shared across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Commentators praised both Sunny for asking difficult questions and Hemsworth for answering them with honesty and vulnerability. Some viewers celebrated the conversation as a necessary examination of masculinity in Hollywood. Others criticized Sunny for being too aggressive, arguing that she had ambushed a guest who had come to promote his work. Still others defended Sunny, noting that her questions were precisely the kind of conversation that needed to happen in public forums. The debate raged online, with thousands of comments pouring in from both sides. But one thing was clear: the conversation had struck a nerve. It had touched on something deep and cultural, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of public discourse for years. Back in the studio, the interview continued for a few more minutes, but the energy had shifted. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Chris Hemsworth smiled warmly at Sunny before the segment ended. I hope we can do this again sometime, he said. Sunny smiled back. I'd like that. The audience applauded once more as the segment concluded, the cameras capturing the warmth of the moment. But the impact of the conversation would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the days that followed, the conversation between Chris Hemsworth and Sunny Hostin became a talking point across media platforms. Entertainment shows analyzed the exchange, commentators offered their perspectives, and viewers continued to debate the central question. What does it mean to be a man in modern culture? Some argued that the conversation had been a step forward, a moment of genuine dialogue between a public figure and a journalist willing to ask difficult questions. Others felt that the exchange highlighted the tensions that still exist in public discourse, the difficulty of having nuanced conversations in a polarized environment. But everyone agreed on one thing: the conversation mattered. It had forced people to think, to question, to examine their own assumptions. And that, perhaps, was the most important outcome of all. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the conversation between Chris Hemsworth and Sunny Hostin in this imagined scenario? Was Sunny's line of questioning fair? Did Hemsworth's answers satisfy you? Share your opinion in the comments below, and let us know which moment stood out to you the most. And if you want more celebrity stories, dramatic moments, and entertaining narratives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Prime Spotlight, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.